Just finished a great run in the California sun, and it is time to duck inside and get down to work on Chapter 5 of the video version of the book, Dare to Ask God Questions. Questions for God and questions about God. And this week, we're going to take a look at why I believe, more than ever, we need to look at the Bible like we would any other book in order to find out it is unlike any other book.
God told Habakkuk, write this. Write what you see. Write it out in big block letters so it can be read on the run. This vision message is a witness pointing to what's coming. It aches for the coming. It can hardly wait. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on its way. It'll come right on time. I've read Habakkuk many times over the years, but this time, two commands in those verses jumped off the page and stirred something deep inside me. Write, wait. I realized that's what I'm doing at this point in my life. Writing and waiting. In one form or another, I've been a writer most of my life, but I've never tried writing anything like this. Plus, I'm being held in a place of waiting, unlike any I've experienced. And I wonder if Habakkuk being told to write gives us another glimpse of how human he was. By us, I mean those of us who are unusually prone to forget things, even if they're really important. Whether on a run and listening to a sermon, or sitting quietly on the sofa reading my Bible, some profound thought or insight from or about God will pop into my head, and I'll think, oh my gosh, that's huge. I'm never going to forget this. And then 3 strides or 3 pages later, no matter how hard I try, I can't remember what it was. In these verses, I sense God slipping into father mode and tenderly yet firmly telling Habakkuk, son, you're going to want to get this next part in writing for yourself and for others. See, telling others was an unpopular and even uncomfortable part of it for men like Habakkuk, an occupational hazard for a prophet. In a unique commentary on the book, Lucille Anderson wrote, this was not a private message or vision. It had to be made available, visible, and clear for all of Judah to read and understand. She continued, as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10, the vision was also recorded for our instruction and as an example to us of how God deals in the lives of his people. I'll have many questions for Habakkuk when I get a chance to talk to him on the other side of human history. And one of them will be about how he knew for sure God was talking to him and what it was like to actually put it in writing. I know Paul said the work of people like Habakkuk was God-breathed, but that doesn't mean written pages or tablets kind of like floated down from the clouds. I'm curious what divine inspiration looked and felt like in real terms. What was the process that got those cherished ancient Hebrew characters on slabs or skins? Habakkuk was one of about 90 prophets mentioned in the Bible. The Old Testament has the work of 16 of them. And there was far more involved writing back then than we can imagine, including what it would have taken just to get the materials together. I can't imagine what they would think if they could see me effortlessly clicking away on words on my laptop, this device that was delivered to my door from thousands of miles away after just a few other clicks on my old laptop. And their awe would go to an entirely different level when they saw dozens of pages emerge from a printer in another room in the house, as opposed to scratching figures into limestone or scrawling them onto animal skin or papyrus. The number of words would be particularly astonishing to them, considering an average letter in Bible times often had fewer than 90 words. Beyond that, with the click of a few buttons, I can have access to thousands of pages of research from the 75 years since the words of Habakkuk and others were discovered in caves on the northern tip of Israel's Dead Sea. There were about 5 yards worth of incredibly precise copies of what Habakkuk wrote. And the thought of that gives the word nerd in me goosebumps, especially as I reread these words from God to him. Write down what I show you. Write it clearly on stone tablets so whoever reads it can run to tell others. And that's what I tried to do with this book. Write what I believe God is showing me in and through Habakkuk. I tried to write clearly with the hope that people can tell others about him. I've been encouraged to hear from a number of people who have said this video version of the book is helping with their understanding. My book editor pushed back on me a little for wanting to include the rest of this chapter. I mean, I understand her concern about it being a digression from anything Habakkuk. That was her phrase. She called it a possible digression from anything Habakkuk. However, as a word nerd and as a bookaholic, I see it as an apologetic for my confidence in the veracity of the Bible as a whole. So tighten your academic seatbelt. We're going to take a deep dive here. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time. The painstaking, ongoing restoration work on them blows me away. And as I write this, one of the tabs at the top of my screen would click to the mind-boggling Dead Sea Scrolls digital project. It allows anyone, and this is a quote from their website, to examine and explore these most ancient manuscripts at a level of detail never before possible. And strangely enough, that makes me think of a famous Homer that does not come to mind for most people under the age of 30. This Homer wrote two of the most famous and cherished books in history, the Iliad and the Odyssey. At a time when we have access to more books than ever, we need to slow down and consider those words. Two of the most famous and cherished books in history. They poetically capture events of the Trojan War, which happened about 5 centuries earlier. The earliest copy there is of a fragment of the Odyssey was written in the 3rd century AD, so that's about 800 years after the war. Since then, 1,700 fragments of copies have been found. I'll explain this more later, but when we see the word copies, we need to think about something immeasurably more work-intensive than what gets spit neatly from a copier in an office or a printer at home. Much bigger word nerds than me have run what's been found of the Iliad and the Odyssey through things like the standards in textual criticisms. And most say Homer's works are as verifiable as anything from ancient literature. And again, we're talking 1,700 fragments, the earliest coming more than 8 centuries after the actual events. Try to hold on to those figures for at least a few moments. Though nowhere near as widely known as those works of Homer, Julius Caesar's The Gallic War is as historically significant. The fragments that have been found of it are believed to be just as authentic. The earliest pieces were found about 1,000 years after Caesar wrote in the 1st century BC. 10 copies have been found. Plato is considered the father of Western philosophy and modern political thought. He lived and wrote around 400 BC. The earliest copies or fragments of copies of his works were found around 900 AD, so about 1300 years after he died. About 250 copies or fragments of what are believed to be his original works have been found, and they've passed all the tests of textual criticism with flying colors. Titus Livy wrote The History of Rome around the time Jesus of Nazareth was born. The first partial fragment of it was found about 4 centuries later. Over the next 1,000 years, 19 copies or shards of copies were found. One is in the highly esteemed Smithsonian Museum, where it's considered one of the most verifiable books about Roman history. Now, I know I just covered a bunch of dates and figures, and it takes a special kind of learnaholic to get excited about those kinds of things. But I hope I was able to at least kind of set the stage for this next part. All that went into the Bible's New Testament is widely believed to have been written between AD 50 and 100. The first fragments of it were found by AD 130, so within a century of the death of Jesus of Nazareth. Before another century had passed, what would form entire books of the New Testament had been found. Just 150 years after being written, enough had been recovered to make entire copies of all the books and letters that fill what we have in the New Testament. By the end of the 3rd century, there were enough copies and fragments to make over 5,000 New Testaments. The total rose to just under 25,000 before 2 more centuries passed. That's 24,000 more than what's been found for Homer's Iliad. While I typically find numbers dry or distracting, I find those increasingly intriguing, especially as I continue digging into them and I think about what they really mean. And that came to a head recently when something caught my attention from a fellow Bible teacher and former Bible skeptic. Chris Brown learned that by AD 300, writers whose works were not included in the Bible made 32,000 references to what went into the New Testament. I find that particularly fascinating, considering the highest powers in the land had the person at the center of it all tortured and crucified, and then inflicted similar abuse on many who believed him and wouldn't shut up about it. Much of what went into the Bible never should have survived. However, at the time I'm writing this, so go back a few months. At the time I was writing this, the full Bible had been translated into 532 languages and partially translated into almost 3,000. Throughout history, well over 5 billion Bibles have been printed, and over 100 million copies of it are still sold every year. Learning about the role of Hebrew scribes dramatically impacted my appreciation of the esteem rabbis in New Testament times had for their ancient Jewish scriptures. The New Testament holds more than 300 references from the Old Testament and more than 2,000 allusions and parallels. And that feeds my extreme respect for the extraordinary process behind the compilation of the entire Bible. Scribes went through rigorous and extensive training, and those found fit to be scribes were held in very high regard. They were essentially living photocopiers, and someone who proved himself to be worthy of being a scribe had like maximum job security. The vast majority of what was used for writing had a lifespan of about 20 years. So scribes worked continuously, duplicating their culture's most cherished literature. The scrutiny of every letter, of every character, would have made the most neurotic acts by the most type A OCD person today seem totally chill by comparison. If even a tiny mistake was found, the whole page was destroyed, and the scribe restarted the meticulous work. Copies ended up as identical to the original as humanly possible. And researchers today have all those fragments to compare to one another for ongoing scrutiny. One unique part of an ancient scribe's work illustrates how seriously they took their jobs. Whenever a Jewish scribe came upon the word for God, he would have to go through a thorough and precise ritual before writing the word. He would leave his work area, bathe, put on clean clothes, and get a brand new pen before returning to his obsession. Just flipping through a few pages of an Old Testament and skimming for the word God would show how frequently that would have happened. And as one fascinated by words, I find the work of the scribes mind-blowing. And all I just sprinted through is a brief summary to try to illustrate why it's hard for me to see how easily the Bible can be shrugged off and even ridiculed, especially by many in the literary/historical/scientific worlds. And don't get me wrong, I readily admit there are parts of the Bible I don't understand and some I don't really like. People around the world continue to ask me questions about that, and I'm often incapable of whipping out tidy and satisfying answers to some of their questions. However, I've learned to slow down long enough to allow what I know to override how I feel, and to remind myself there isn't anything that comes even remotely close to having been scrutinized like the Bible. And that brings to mind one of my favorite quotes. It is one of the most refreshingly honest things I've seen attributed to a scientist about one of the central claims of the Bible. There are only two possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. The quotation continues, spontaneous generation, that life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproved 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others. And this quote continues, that leaves us with only one possible conclusion. Life arose as a creative act of God. I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. I appreciate that kind of transparency from someone with Dr. George Wald's brilliance, although I have deep concerns about his influence, and at some of the highest levels of academia and thought. He earned his first science degree in 1927. 5 years later, he earned a PhD in zoology from New York's highly esteemed Columbia University. After 40 years of groundbreaking work, Wald received a share of the 1967 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. It was called The Biochemistry of Vision. Throughout his life, he learned and taught in some of the most prestigious settings in the world. Directly and indirectly, he had a part to play in the erosion of the Bible's credibility as it was pushed to the margin and then out of the academic community. I have several friends in the scientific community who assure me they do not believe in faith, and they don't appreciate it when I challenge them on that and tell them I believe they do have faith. They just call it theory. Merriam-Webster defines faith as trust in and loyalty to God, or in more general terms, belief in something for which there is no proof. But it also says theory is a, quote, hypothesis assumed for the sake of arguments or investigation or an unproven assumption. It takes a lot of faith to believe some scientific theories. Even Dr. George Wald showed faith. But in atheism, I believe being an atheist ultimately means putting faith in yourself. As I continue to get to know myself, I'm reminded the man who looks back at me in the mirror when I shave is a very poor option for the object of faith. I don't think you could deny the brilliance or the contribution to science of a man like Dr. George Wald, any more than you could deny the intelligence or the contribution to theology of a man like C.S. Lewis. I mention him because I almost always think of one of my favorite quotes of his when I'm with someone like Dr. George Wald, and I reread that lengthy quote of his we just saw. C.S. Lewis wrote, "I'm here to try to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about God. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." Lewis said that is the one thing we must not say, because a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. Lewis continued, "You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God." I see a connection between Lewis's thoughts and my compulsion to keep digging into the Bible. More than ever, I'm at a point in life where I believe I must either shrug it off as the most damaging literary scam in history or pursue it with increasing urgency and passion. Revisiting, compiling, and consolidating decades of formal and informal research, and then straining to find words to articulate it, is feeding humble confidence in the second option. My certainty grows as I deepen my understanding of the Bible's original languages and contexts, as I continue to put the Bible through the scientific method and textual criticism. Lee Strobel, a fellow former journalist turned pastor, wrote, "We should treat the Bible like any other book in order to show it's not like any other book." And that's what I'm trying to do with Habakkuk. And we'll dive back into his pursuit of God and God's pursuit of him in the next video. Chapter 6 of Dare to Ask God Questions. Questions for God and questions about God.
How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in this excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said? To you who for refuge to Jesus has fled. Fear not, I am with thee, O be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous omnipotent hand. call thee to go. The rivers of sorrow shall not overflow, for I will be with thee, thy troubles to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. The soul that on Jesus has leaned for repose, I will not desert to thy foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never, no, never